Two people left home on an ordinary morning and never came back. One was an adult with plans for the day. The other was a child who depended on her. There was no warning sign, no message, no visible reason to worry when they set out. Hours passed, then more time followed, and silence replaced routine. What should have been a simple errand turned into absence. Neighbors noticed nothing unusual. Streets kept moving. Life around them continued without pause. Yet something had gone wrong in a way no one could see at first. For decades, the truth stayed locked inside evidence that could not speak. Only much later did science catch up with what investigators could not reach at the time. If you value reporting that stays grounded in records and verified work, consider subscribing to the channel so these stories can keep being told with care. In early 1980, Lynn Vest lived in Columbus, Ohio, raising her young nephew, Jeremy Pickens. She was responsible for him that day, handling routine tasks that involved leaving the house together. Nothing about the plan suggested risk. She was familiar with the area, familiar with daily movement around the city, and familiar with the child she cared for. When the two left, there was no reason for alarm, no call made to anyone about trouble, and no delay expected in their return. As hours passed, concern slowly replaced patience. Family members waited, then checked in, then began to worry. When evening arrived without contact, the situation could no longer be explained as delay or distraction. Law enforcement was notified, and attention turned to finding where they had gone. Early steps focused on retracing expected routes and checking places tied to the errands they were believed to be handling. The search soon led to a vehicle connected to them. Its location did not match where it should have been if the day had gone as planned. That discovery shifted the response from concern to urgency. Officers examined what they could, documenting the scene and preserving items that might later explain what happened. At the time, tools were limited. Techniques that would become standard decades later did not yet exist. What could be collected was collected. What could not be interpreted was stored and logged. The discovery of Lynn Vest and Jeremy Pickens confirmed the worst outcome. The focus immediately turned to responsibility and explanation. Investigators worked with what they had, interviewing people who might have seen something, reviewing movements around the area, and examining physical traces found at the scene. Leads were followed, then exhausted. Without clear direction, the investigation slowed. Despite the effort, answers remained out of reach. Evidence that might have held the key could not yet be unlocked. Hair and other materials were examined using methods available at the time, producing limited conclusions. Names were considered, then ruled out, not because certainty had been reached, but because proof could not be established. Over time, active work gave way to records, and the file moved from current priority to unresolved history. For the families, the absence of resolution did not fade. Questions remained unanswered, and the lack of accountability weighed heavily. For investigators, the limitations were understood. The problem was not neglect, but capability. The science needed to move further before progress could resume. What remained was preserved. Evidence was stored. Reports were kept. Though nothing moved forward in a visible way, the groundwork was quietly maintained. Years later, that patience would matter. What could not speak in 1980 would eventually be heard, not through memory or confession, but through technology that had not yet been imagined when two people left home and never returned. The first concrete sign that something had gone wrong came not from a witness, but from absence. When Lynn Vest and Jeremy Pickens did not arrive where they were expected, attention shifted from waiting to searching. Family members retraced likely paths and contacted authorities with growing urgency. The early response followed routine procedure, gathering basic information about where they were last seen and what they were believed to be doing that day. Nothing suggested conflict before they left, which made the silence harder to explain. Law enforcement began checking locations tied to everyday movement. Parking areas, nearby streets, and places connected to errands were reviewed. The goal was simple: to locate the pair and confirm whether delay or disruption had caused the concern. That effort led to the discovery of a vehicle associated with them. Its position did not align with any reasonable stop along the expected route. This shifted the focus from locating people to examining a scene. Officers secured the area and documented what they could observe. The vehicle itself became the primary point of reference. Items inside were noted, along with signs that suggested the trip had ended abruptly rather than by choice. At the time, interpretation relied heavily on visible indicators and basic forensic examination. Technology that would later define investigations had not yet been developed. What mattered was careful handling and accurate record-keeping. As the search expanded, additional areas nearby were examined. The effort involved patrol officers, investigators, and volunteers who understood the urgency of finding a child and the adult responsible for him. The mood was tense but controlled. Procedures were followed methodically, balancing speed with caution. Each step was taken with the understanding that early mistakes could close off future possibilities. When Lynn Vest and Jeremy Pickens were located, the situation moved into a different category. The priority became documentation and preservation. Investigators recorded the surroundings, the condition of the scene, and the physical evidence present. Every item collected was logged according to standards of the time. Hair, fibers, and other trace materials were preserved, even when immediate analysis could not provide answers. The immediate response also included outreach to the community. Officers canvassed nearby residents and businesses, asking about unfamiliar vehicles, unusual activity, or anything that stood out during the day. These conversations produced fragments rather than direction. Memories were vague, times uncertain, and no single account connected clearly to what had occurred. Still, each report was written down and added to the growing file. Attention then turned inward, reviewing whether any prior concerns or conflicts might explain the outcome. Background checks focused on known associates and recent interactions. Nothing pointed clearly toward a specific individual. Without a defined suspect, the investigation relied on process rather than pursuit. Evidence was examined again and again using available methods, producing limited conclusions that neither confirmed nor ruled out involvement. The early days were marked by steady effort rather than dramatic breakthroughs. Investigators understood that time mattered, but they also recognized the boundaries imposed by the tools of that era. What could be done was done thoroughly. What could not be solved immediately was preserved for later review. The response reflected discipline rather than haste, built on the belief that careful work, even without immediate results, would keep the possibility advancers alive. With the initial response completed, attention turned toward understanding how Lynn Vest and Jeremy Pickens crossed paths with whoever was responsible. Investigators reviewed every documented movement connected to the day they left home. The focus stayed narrow at first, centered on where they had gone, how long each stop should have taken, and what could have interrupted that routine. The absence of forced signs at the starting point suggested the encounter did not begin there, which pushed investigators to look outward rather than inward. Background information was gathered methodically. Family members, acquaintances, and people who had regular contact with Lynn Vest were interviewed to determine whether any tension or concern had surfaced before that day. These conversations did not reveal disputes, threats, or warning signals. Her life appeared structured and predictable, shaped by work, family responsibility, and daily obligations. That lack of conflict removed one common explanation and forced investigators to widen their scope. Law enforcement reviewed individuals who might have been in proximity to the locations identified during the search. This included people living nearby, individuals known for transient activity, and anyone whose presence could not be accounted for through routine explanation. Names were recorded, background checks were conducted, and alibis were examined where possible. Some individuals were questioned briefly, others more extensively. None could be tied directly to the evidence collected. Physical findings from the scene were re-examined with care. Hair and fiber material was sent through laboratory processes available at the time. These methods relied on comparison and exclusion rather than identification. Results often came back inconclusive, not because the material lacked value, but because science had not yet reached the point where certainty could be achieved. Investigators documented these limitations clearly, understanding that future advances might change what those materials could reveal. As days turned into weeks, the investigatory approach shifted from immediate pursuit to structured review. Reports were organized, timelines were reconstructed using confirmed sightings and verifiable records, and inconsistencies were noted. Each piece of information was weighed against others to see whether patterns emerged. Despite the effort, nothing aligned in a way that pointed clearly toward responsibility. The lack of direction created pressure both internally and from the community. Questions came from family members seeking clarity, from residents wanting reassurance, and from within the department itself as resources were balanced against other demands. Investigators remained cautious, aware that speculation could cause harm without producing results. The decision was made to avoid public accusations without evidence strong enough to hold. During this period, the investigation relied heavily on discipline. Every tip was logged, even those that seemed unlikely. Every name was preserved in records, even when ruled out by circumstance. This approach was not driven by optimism, but by procedure. The goal was not immediate resolution, but preservation of integrity. If answers came later, they would depend on the accuracy of what was recorded now. As momentum slowed, the work did not stop. Files remained active, evidence remained secured, and responsibility remained acknowledged. What investigators could not solve with the tools of the time was not abandoned. Instead, it was stored carefully, with the understanding that progress in science often comes long after questions are first asked. The early investigation did not produce a name, but it created a foundation that would endure far beyond those initial efforts. As active leads grew thin, the investigation shifted toward the physical record left behind. What remained now carried greater weight than interviews or assumptions. Every item collected during the initial response was reviewed again, not with the expectation of immediate answers, but with the responsibility of preservation. Investigators understood that material evidence could outlast memory, and that careful handling mattered even when conclusions were not yet possible. The items logged from the scene were stored according to standards used at the time. Hair samples, fibers, and trace materials were sealed, labeled, and placed into long-term custody. Reports detailed where each piece came from and how it was collected. Photographs and written notes documented positions, conditions, and relationships between objects. Even when interpretation could not move forward, documentation continued with precision. Forensic testing available in 1980 relied on comparison rather than identification. Hair analysis could suggest similarity or difference, but it could not establish identity. Fibers could indicate contact, but not origin beyond broad categories. Investigators requested testing within those limits, receiving results that narrowed possibilities without resolving them. The outcome was not failure, but boundary. Science had reached a point where it could exclude some paths, but not confirm others. At the same time, not everything survived equally. Environmental exposure, handling practices of the era, and the passage of time affected certain materials. Some items degraded, others lost context as memory faded. Records remained, but human recall weakened. This imbalance between preserved objects and fading recollection created gaps that could not be filled through effort alone. Decisions made during this period reflected caution rather than urgency. Evidence was not discarded simply because it lacked immediate value. Items were retained even when their purpose was unclear. This approach required storage space, administrative oversight, and long-term commitment. It also required accepting that results might never come. Still, investigators chose retention over closure, believing future methods could change the meaning of what they held. The broader investigative file grew heavier and quieter. Pages accumulated, boxes were sealed. Responsibilities shifted from active pursuit to custodial care. This did not signal abandonment. It marked a transition from action to endurance. The work became less visible, but no less deliberate. Outside the department, attention faded. New events drew focus. Other priorities demanded resources. Yet the evidence remained untouched by time in a physical sense, waiting without expectation. Its value lay not in certainty, but in possibility. What was lost could not be recovered. Missed opportunities, limited tools, and incomplete context formed permanent absences. What was preserved, however, remained intact enough to matter. The balance between those two realities defined the investigation for years. It was not progress, but it was not defeat. It was a decision to keep the door open, even when the key did not yet exist. As time moved forward, the investigation settled into a long stretch without visible change. The file remained open, but activity slowed as available leads were exhausted. Officers rotated, assignments shifted, and attention moved to newer emergencies. What remained was a detailed record that no longer grew through discovery, only through maintenance. The absence of progress did not reflect lack of care, but the limits of what could be done with what was known. For the families, silence carried its own weight. Days became months, then years, marked by anniversaries without explanation. Questions stayed specific and practical. Where did they go? Who saw them last? Why did nothing surface? Without answers, the loss resisted closure. Grief did not resolve into understanding, and time did not soften the uncertainty. It only stretched it. Within law enforcement, the file was reviewed periodically. Supervisors checked for overlooked details. New personnel scanned reports with fresh eyes. Each review ended the same way, with no clear path forward. What had been documented was thorough. What was missing could not be invented. Investigators resisted the temptation to force conclusions where proof did not exist. The community gradually stopped asking. News coverage faded. Public memory narrowed to fragments. For many residents, the names became distant, associated with an old headline rather than a living question. The lack of updates made the situation appear settled, even though nothing had been resolved. This created a quiet divide between perception and reality. Evidence remained secured. Storage conditions were monitored. Inventory lists were updated. Each item retained its tag and description, unchanged by the years around it. This required institutional discipline. Maintaining dormant evidence demands justification, and that justification rested on the possibility of future advancement. Even without certainty, the materials were treated as unfinished work rather than relics. Occasionally, tips arrived. Some were vague recollections from people revisiting the past. Others were rumors shaped by distance and time. Each was logged, assessed, and closed without result. None introduced information strong enough to alter the direction of the investigation. Still, the practice of review continued, reinforcing the commitment to accuracy over speed. The unanswered questions persisted not because they were ignored, but because they were resistant. The absence of resolution was not an ending. It was a condition shaped by limitations, patience, and restraint. Investigators understood that forcing conclusions would only replace one uncertainty with another. What endured through the silence was a decision made early on, to preserve rather than discard, to document rather than assume, and to wait rather than guess. The years without movement did not erase responsibility. They simply delayed accountability, leaving the truth suspended, intact, but unreachable, until something beyond time itself could change the balance. Decades after the investigation slowed, change came from outside the original work. The evidence had not moved, but science had. For many years, the materials collected could only suggest broad characteristics. Hair could be compared visually. Fibers could be grouped by type. None of this allowed a clear link to an individual. As research progressed, those same materials gained new potential without ever leaving storage. The development of DNA profiling altered how physical evidence could be understood. Early versions required large and well-preserved samples. That limited their use in older investigations. Over time, methods improved. Smaller fragments became usable. Degraded material could be tested. This gradual progress did not happen all at once. It unfolded through research, validation, and cautious adoption by forensic laboratories. Law enforcement agencies across the country began reviewing unsolved investigations with preserved evidence. The question was no longer whether something had been collected, but whether it could now speak in a way it could not before. In Columbus, records showed that hair evidence connected to Lynn Vest and Jeremy Pickens remained intact. The documentation was clear. The chain of custody was complete. That alone made reconsideration possible. Initial testing focused on determining whether viable genetic material could still be extracted. This step did not assume success. It was exploratory, designed to confirm whether the samples had survived time and storage conditions. When results indicated usable material, the scope of possibility widened. What once offered exclusion now held the promise of identification. Advances also changed how results could be interpreted. DNA profiles could be compared against known standards, but more importantly, they could be used in broader databases. This represented a shift from direct matching to relational searching. Instead of asking whether a sample belonged to a specific person, investigators could ask whether it shared lineage with others already recorded. These changes required careful consideration. Protocols governed when and how older evidence could be tested. Legal standards demanded accuracy and repeatability. Investigators worked alongside forensic experts to ensure that any findings would withstand scrutiny. The goal was not speed, but reliability. A single error could undermine decades of restraint. The renewed examination did not rewrite earlier work, it built upon it. Reports from 1980 provided context for where materials were found and how they related to the event. Without those records, new science would have lacked direction. The past and present aligned, not through coincidence, but through documentation maintained over time. This renewed effort marked a turning point. It did not yet provide names or conclusions, but it changed the nature of the investigation. The question shifted from whether answers were possible to how they might be reached responsibly. Technology had finally advanced far enough to engage with what had been preserved. The process remained methodical. Testing was conducted in stages. Results were reviewed, verified, and compared. Each step followed established standards, ensuring that progress did not outpace accuracy. Investigators understood that the significance of this moment lay not in promise, but in proof. For years, the evidence had waited without voice. It had not aged into irrelevance. It had waited for the tools capable of interpreting it fully. With those tools now available, the investigation moved forward again, not through memory or confession, but through measurable data grounded in science. Once usable genetic material was confirmed, investigators faced a new set of decisions. Traditional database comparison had limits, especially when the individual responsible had never been arrested or submitted a reference sample. The profile produced from the preserved evidence did not immediately match anyone in criminal systems. That result did not end the effort. It redirected it toward a method that had only recently become viable. Forensic genealogy offered a different approach. Instead of searching for an exact identity, analysts looked for genetic relationships. Public genealogy databases contained profiles submitted voluntarily by individuals researching family history. When permitted by law and policy, investigators could compare crime scene DNA against those records, not to find a name directly, but to locate distant relatives who shared portions of genetic code. This process required collaboration between detectives, forensic scientists, and specialized genealogists. The work began with building a profile strong enough for relational searching. Once that was complete, partial matches emerged, not close family, but individuals connected through extended lineage. Each match represented a branch point, not an answer. Genealogists then began constructing family trees. This work relied on public records, census data, birth certificates, marriage filings, and obituaries. Names were added carefully, connections were verified before moving further. The goal was to move forward without assumption, narrowing possibilities through documented relationships rather than speculation. As family structures expanded across generations, investigators focused on individuals who fit specific criteria. Age, geographic proximity, and opportunity mattered. Someone had to be alive at the time of the crime, present in the region, and capable of contact with Lynn Vest and Jeremy Pickens. Each filter reduced the field, turning a wide network into a smaller group of candidates. This stage demanded patience. Family trees can contain errors, name changes, and missing records. Every detail required confirmation. Investigators cross-checked findings against original reports from 1980, aligning genealogical data with known movements and locations. This ensured continuity between old evidence and new methods. As the work progressed, attention narrowed toward a single individual whose background aligned with both genetic linkage and geographic access. This did not mean guilt had been established. It meant the investigation had reached a point where focused verification was justified. From here, confirmation required direct comparison, not inference. Law enforcement followed procedure. Legal steps were taken to obtain reference material connected to the individual under review. This was done carefully, respecting standards designed to prevent overreach. The purpose was simple: to determine whether the preserved evidence matched directly. The comparison provided clarity. The genetic profile from the preserved material aligned conclusively with the individual identified through genealogical research. This result did not depend on probability or similarity. It was a direct match, grounded in established forensic standards. For investigators, this moment carried weight, not because it ended uncertainty, but because it validated decades of restraint. The answer had not been forced. It had been reached through preservation, patience, and progress in science. The identification did not rewrite the past, it explained it. What followed required a different kind of response. The investigation shifted from searching to accounting. Questions now focused on what could be done with the information, how it would be communicated, and what limits still applied. The work of forensic genealogy had done its part. It had given a name to evidence that had waited in silence for more than 40 years. The confirmation of the genetic match required careful handling. Investigators did not rush to announcement or assumption. The identification had to be verified through independent review and procedural checks. Laboratory analysts confirmed the results using established standards, ensuring the profile obtained from preserved evidence aligned fully with the reference material. This step removed uncertainty that had surrounded the investigation for decades. Once verification was complete, attention turned to documenting the identification in a way that could withstand scrutiny. Reports detailed how the evidence had been preserved, how testing was conducted, and how the comparison was made. Each stage was recorded clearly, creating a direct line from the original collection to the present conclusion. The integrity of that chain mattered as much as the result itself. Investigators then reviewed records connected to Charles Elliott. Background information was gathered to understand his presence in Columbus at the time Lynn Vest and Jeremy Pickens were killed. Employment history, addresses, and known movements were examined against the original investigative file. The alignment was consistent with opportunity and proximity. This did not require speculation. It relied on documented facts that matched the timeline already established decades earlier. The identification carried limits that were acknowledged immediately. Elliott was no longer alive. This reality shaped every decision that followed. There would be no arrest, no interrogation, and no courtroom proceedings. The purpose of the investigation shifted toward formal resolution rather than prosecution. Law enforcement focused on clarity and transparency, ensuring the conclusion rested solely on evidence. Notification procedures were handled with care. Surviving family members were informed before any public statement was made. Investigators explained how the identification was reached, what the evidence showed, and what could not be changed. The goal was understanding rather than closure. For families who had lived with uncertainty, the information carried weight even without legal consequence. Public communication followed a measured approach. Officials outlined the scientific process, the role of preserved evidence, and the limitations imposed by time. They avoided language that suggested triumph or finality. The emphasis remained on accountability through truth, not punishment. The identification answered a question that had persisted for more than 40 years, but it did not erase the loss. Internally, the department conducted a review of the investigation from start to finish. This review was not designed to assign blame, but to document lessons. The importance of evidence preservation, accurate record-keeping, and patience under uncertainty became clear themes. The identification of Elliott validated decisions made long ago by individuals who could not have known how science would evolve. The conclusion also highlighted restraint. Investigators had resisted public speculation and premature conclusions during years when answers were unavailable. That restraint preserved credibility. When the identification was finally made, it rested on data rather than theory. This distinction mattered for the families, the community, and the record itself. The name attached to the evidence did not change what happened in 1980. It changed how the history of that day could be understood. The investigation had moved from unknown to known, not through confession or chance, but through methodical work sustained across generations. The identification of Charles Elliott marked the point where silence ended and factual clarity took its place. With the identification complete, the investigation entered a final and constrained space defined by law rather than evidence. The confirmation of Charles Elliott as the individual linked through DNA resolved the question of responsibility, but it did not create a path toward prosecution. Elliott had died years earlier, placing him outside the reach of criminal proceedings. This fact shaped every remaining action taken by law enforcement. Investigators reviewed legal standards to determine what steps were appropriate. Without a living suspect, no charges could be filed and no court process could follow. The role of the justice system in this situation was limited to acknowledgement rather than adjudication. The resolution would exist in records and findings, not in a courtroom. Authorities prepared a formal closing of the investigation. This involved summarizing the original evidence, the preservation history, the scientific methods applied decades later, and the conclusions reached through forensic genealogy. Each element had to be clear enough to stand on its own. The purpose was not to persuade a jury, but to establish an accurate public record. Prosecutors were consulted to confirm that no additional legal avenues remained. Their review focused on whether any associated offenses could be addressed posthumously, or whether accomplice liability existed. The conclusion was narrow and firm. No further action was legally possible. The responsibility identified through DNA ended with the individual named. This reality carried a different weight than unresolved uncertainty. For many years, the lack of answers had left families and investigators suspended between questions and hope. The identification replaced that tension with clarity. Even though it offered no trial or sentence, the distinction mattered. Knowing who was responsible did not equate to legal accountability, but it did correct the historical record. Law enforcement agencies involved in the work coordinated their messaging carefully. Public statements avoided language suggesting justice had been fully served. Instead, they emphasized truth, verification, and transparency. The focus remained on how the conclusion was reached and why it mattered rather than on outcomes that could no longer occur. The investigation file was updated to reflect its resolved status. This did not erase the past, it documented it accurately. Records that once ended with unanswered questions now ended with evidence-based identification and clear explanation of limits. This change affected how the investigation would be referenced in the future, shifting it from unresolved to concluded with qualification. Internally, investigators reflected on the process. The resolution affirmed the value of long-term evidence care and patient review. It also highlighted the boundaries of justice when time removes the possibility of prosecution. These realities coexist without contradiction. One can achieve factual clarity without achieving legal consequence. The resolution of the investigation did not bring finality in a traditional sense. It brought definition. The uncertainty that had surrounded Lynn Vest and Jeremy Pickens for more than 42 years was replaced with documented understanding. The law could go no further, but the truth had reached its endpoint. When the investigation reached its conclusion, the effect spread quietly rather than publicly. There was no courtroom, no sentence, and no visible moment that marked an end. Instead, information moved first toward the families who had carried uncertainty for most of their lives. The responsibility of law enforcement was not only to present findings, but to do so with care, clarity, and restraint. For surviving relatives, the identification answered a question that had remained open since 1980. The absence of a legal process did not diminish the importance of knowing who was responsible. What mattered was accuracy. The explanation was grounded in preserved evidence, scientific testing, and documented procedure. Families were given time, context, and opportunity to understand how the conclusion had been reached and why the outcome could not include prosecution. The emotional response did not follow a single path. Some felt relief that the unknown no longer dominated memory. Others felt frustration that accountability could not take a formal shape. Both reactions existed side by side. The passage of decades had altered expectations. Closure did not mean resolution in the traditional sense. It meant clarity without remedy. Within the community, the news resurfaced an event that many had forgotten or never known. Coverage focused on the science rather than the violence. Attention centered on how preserved evidence and modern methods intersected after so many years. The story became less about the act itself and more about the process that finally explained it. This framing mattered. It reinforced the idea that careful work can outlast time. For law enforcement, the conclusion brought professional reflection. Investigators involved in the renewed work understood they were completing a responsibility inherited from others. The outcome validated decisions made long before, especially the choice to retain evidence that could not yet be interpreted. It also underscored the importance of documentation that remains usable decades later. The community response remained measured. There were no public demonstrations or demands. Instead, there was acknowledgement. Residents recognized the weight carried by the families and the patience required to reach an answer. The absence of spectacle allowed space for respect rather than reaction. Educational impact followed naturally. The investigation became an example referenced in discussions about forensic genealogy and cold case review. It illustrated how science can extend the reach of accountability without replacing ethical boundaries. The focus stayed on method rather than emotion, reinforcing trust in process over narrative. The identification did not change the past, but it reshaped how it was remembered. Lynn Vest and Jeremy Pickens were no longer defined solely by uncertainty. Their names became connected to a documented truth rather than an open question. This distinction mattered to those who remembered them not as evidence, but as people. The impact of the conclusion was subtle but lasting. It replaced speculation with record, rumor with confirmation, and silence with explanation. For families and community alike, the value lay not in punishment but in accuracy. After more than 40 years, the weight of not knowing had been lifted, leaving behind a history that could finally be understood as it truly was. The conclusion of the investigation left behind more than an answer. It offered a record of how patience, restraint, and preservation can shape outcomes long after immediate action has failed. The work surrounding Lynn Vest and Jeremy Pickens showed that resolution does not always come through speed or intensity, but through accuracy maintained over time. One of the clearest lessons was the value of evidence care. Items collected in 1980 were not fully understood when they were stored. Their significance depended on decisions made by people who could not predict future technology. Proper labeling, secure storage, and clear documentation allowed those materials to remain meaningful decades later. Without that discipline, later science would have had nothing to examine. The investigation also highlighted the limits of early certainty. Investigators resisted pressure to force conclusions when proof did not exist. This restraint prevented misidentification and protected the integrity of the record. The absence of an early answer was difficult, but it proved preferable to an incorrect one. Time did not correct mistakes. It rewarded accuracy. Scientific progress played a decisive role, but it did not act alone. Advances in DNA testing and forensic genealogy mattered only because foundational work had been done carefully. Technology did not replace investigation, it completed it. The outcome reflected collaboration between past and present, rather than a sudden breakthrough. Legal boundaries formed another important lesson. Identifying responsibility did not guarantee prosecution. The justice system has limits defined by time and circumstance. Accepting those limits while still pursuing truth required clarity of purpose. The goal shifted from punishment to record correction, ensuring history reflected evidence rather than uncertainty. The impact on families underscored the importance of communication. Providing clear explanation without exaggeration helped replace speculation with understanding. Even without formal accountability, accurate information carried weight. It allowed memory to rest on fact rather than unanswered questions. For law enforcement, the investigation reinforced institutional responsibility. Work does not end when leads disappear. Stewardship of unresolved investigations is part of public trust. Maintaining files, reviewing evidence, and remaining open to future possibility ensures that unanswered questions are not abandoned. The broader lesson extended beyond one investigation. It demonstrated how long-term commitment, ethical restraint, and scientific evolution can intersect. Answers may arrive long after events pass from public attention. When they do, their value depends on how carefully the past was handled. After more than 4 decades, the story of Lynn Vest and Jeremy Pickens moved from uncertainty to documented truth. That transition did not change what happened, but it changed how it could be understood. The lesson was simple and demanding. Truth can endure, but only if it is protected until it is ready to be known.